We're just about ready to turn the podium over to our keynote speaker this evening, but a couple of quick procedural announcements first. Anyone who asked around dinner time for a shuttle change, check in with reception on your way out to get the updated details on that. And the shuttle back to the hotels will leave here at 9 p.m. So just a couple of final words on my part before we close out. I have spent the weekend looking around, and I see, even here at dinner, central bankers and monetary theorists, graduate students, people of all kinds, people that I know from many different places, and I see you all exchanging ideas and talking together and building something of a community. It is, to me, quite encouraging. So thank you for that. Just a few words of thanks to all the CG team, to Paul and Rohinton and Fred and Colleen. Thank you very much for having us and for all your work. A very, very special thanks to Agatha and Lauren, who did a huge amount of work before the conference. Before the conference and during the conference, getting everyone here and making everything happen. They made my life very easy, so thank you very much. I give you now Perry Merling to introduce our keynote speaker. Thanks.
And of course, we want to thank Dan. Yes. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, a distinguished scholar and really good friend of mine, Katharina Pistor. She's the Michael Sovern Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and Director of the university's Center on Global Legal Transformation, and she serves as a member of its Committee on Global Thought. But I got to know her because she's principal investigator of the Global Finance and Law Initiative, an INET-funded collaborative research project aimed at reconceptualizing the relationship between finance and law. I actually wrote a paper for her, and let me tell you, she's a taskmaster. In 2012, she received the Max Planck Research Award for her contributions to international financial regulation, and she's still moving. She's going to talk to us today about dichotomies in law and finance. Welcome, Katharina Pistor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would really like to thank CG and INET for having me, for putting up this great event. And I also want to thank all of you because I have to say this kind of economics conferences is actually also fun for non-economists. And I've attended a lot of economist conferences in the past, and for the most part, the big issues are background music to methodologies that are not being questioned so that people can poke holes into each other's models, whether econometrics, algebra, or game theory. So going back to big issues and putting methodology back on the table, I find really stimulating, and so thanks for doing this all together here. When I wrote my grant 2 years ago, roughly, to launch this project, the Global Finance and Law Initiative, I had some conversations with INET people, and at the time I was saying, if you really want to change the way we think about the economy, you cannot only talk to economists. Precisely because economics has been so expansionary and almost imperialist, you have to talk to other disciplines, and in particular, you have to talk to lawyers, because they have translated for the last 40 years economics into hardwired regulations, laws, and legal interpretations. And we teach this stuff daily at law schools. We don't even teach an introductory course in law and economics anymore because people feel that it has made its way into all disciplines anyway, so we can do away with that. But it's done in a highly non-reflected fashion, and I think if we wanted to really change the way we think about economics and govern economics, we have to bring the lawyers back in. So I'm all the more grateful for having received some startup funds from INET to launch this initiative. And what it was really was an initiative of bringing 9 scholars around a table from economics, law and economics, and socioeconomics to rethink the relationship between law and finance. And when I first argued that you have to talk to lawyers because they're important for translating economics, I think after having spent 2 years with INET Money thinking about these issues, I have become more radicalized. And I would now say you cannot even understand finance if you don't put law up front and center. Okay, so let me explain why. But I want to do this in a fashion that also speaks to the theme of the conference, the false dichotomies, because I found it intriguing to think about the journey that we took on this project through the lens of the dichotomy story. So I basically sat back and said, well, what kind of dichotomies have been abound in the field of law and finance as discussed over the last 20 years or so? And clearly there's been always law and finance, and the assumption was there is finance out there and then law fixes things that finance can't fix on its own, so you deal with market failures and you deal with information problems and transaction problems, etc. Then of course there's the big dichotomy of state and market, of public and private, money and credit, rational and irrational, autonomous, embedded, uncertainty and risk, knowledge and information, law and power, a mumble jumble of dichotomies. Where do we start and where do we end? Which ones of them are important? Which ones of them are true and which ones of them are false? So clearly, as we all know, dichotomies are useful sometimes to frame an issue, just to have the two polar points of a debate carved out. They're very often more tractable than entire complex theories. They're useful heuristic devices, but of course they also overstate the differences between these two concepts on the polar ends, and thereby I think they very often stand in the way of re-theorizing. So we have to take them with caution. They're useful, but they can also be problematic. Now, from the perspective of this project that I have been running over the last 2 years, what turned out now with hindsight, and I did not think about this as we walked through this project, as we did this, is we started this project actually with a set of dichotomies that I was conscious of. So we said it is about the relationship of law and finance, and we pitched them at two opposite ends. It is about state versus markets, and we felt what was also really important was whether actors are either autonomous or embedded, or whether they're rational or irrational. Well, as we went through the project, I think some of the dichotomies turned out to be sort of false or had to be conceptualized as synthesis rather than dichotomies. And I think that goes for law and finance, state and market, public-private, money versus credit. And some turned out to be simply of relatively less importance than we had thought up front, and I would say that goes for autonomous versus embedded, rational versus irrational. And then there were some dichotomies that turned out to be really critical. So uncertainty versus risk, knowledge versus information, and law versus power were critical for building a new theory. And what I'm talking about here is we're trying to build or develop an inductive theory that is basically using observations of the real world financial system as we have observed it through the lens of selected case studies, and we're generalizing about the structure of finance from that. So it's an inductive, not a deductive theory. But once some of these dichotomies are critical because they help us build this theory, and jointly with some of the non-dichotomous or new synthesis, they offer, I would argue, a coherent reconceptualization of finance and help us to derive some important implications. So what are the building blocks of this new legal theory of finance? And I want to be modest here. My paper that I'm just finished writing and we're submitting for publication very soon is called Towards a Legal Theory of Finance. So I'm not claiming that we're entirely there yet, and maybe you can help us get there. So we're basically starting from several premises that are straight out of economics, at least some parts of economics, but I think at least with respect to fundamental uncertainty, it's so widely acknowledged that I would simply call it a premise, some basic facts that few people would dispute. I realize that on the second concept, the second premise, liquidity constraint, there is so much more debate, and nonetheless, I think the evidence of the global financial crisis shows quite evidently that sometimes there is liquidity, and then the next day it might be gone, so there must be something like a liquidity constraint. And jointly, these two premises render financial markets inherently unstable. So that's nothing new, that's not something that we are adding. But what we are adding is to suggest that financial systems are rule-bound systems, that they're actually essential hybrid rather than being either state or market or private or public, that there's something called the law of finance paradox that is very different from the conceptualization that law is the crutches to a financial system that can barely manage on its own, just needs a little bit support. Also that law is actually not always the binding, credible commitment that it's portrayed to be, but it is elastic. And it's elastic in a particular way, namely it is elastic at the core and rather rigid on the periphery. And that leads us essentially to a political economy of finance, which is to suggest that actually power is the differential relationship to law. Where law becomes elastic, power becomes salient. So let me try to illustrate these different elements, and I will come back to some of the dichotomies that we drop, refine, or synthesize along the way. I don't think I have to say much here about fundamental uncertainty, so I just want to skip over this. Knight and Keynes and others, of course, have said this. We think there are true dichotomies here. It is really important to distinguish uncertainty and risk, and it's really important to distinguish knowledge and information. And I'm saying this in particular to a legal audience because much of financial regulation, especially in the regulation of markets, has been geared towards making information more readily available, better packaged, and more transparent. But if we're also dealing with issues of fundamental uncertainty, that cannot be enough. And if we're just doing this again and again, we're fooling ourselves. So I can skip that. Liquidity constraint, those of you, of course, who have read Keynes and Minsky and many others, including Perry Merling here, are familiar with that. It is important to realize that in this kind of story, we have to drop one important dichotomy, which is the dichotomy between money and credit, because in the end, all the financial assets that are created in one way or another have to be convertible into that money, which is actually the high-powered money that is backed by a sovereign. So there is a continuum from state money to private money. These are not fully distinct things. Importantly, financial assets, or IOUs, are issued by many different players that can be private and public. That's all fine. But not all of them are equally credible. And the credibility, in fact, is a function of the ability to convert them at some point into state money. The fact that they are not all equally credible also renders the financial system inherently hierarchical, as Perry has explained in several of his writings. So here are once more the elements of our legal theory of finance. Finance is a rule-bound system. It is essentially hybrid. There's a law and finance paradox. It is elastic, and power is the differential relation to law. What do I mean by saying that finance is essentially a rule-bound system? Well, start from the bottom. Every financial instrument that we enter into is essentially a contract. And I think most of you will follow that far. It's a contractual arrangement. I owe you something, and I pay in the future, but I get something from you in return today. Clearly, you can enter into that without legal backing. But once we want to talk about a market of some scale, we have to ensure the enforceability of these instruments. And once we want to trade them even broader, we have to make sure that they do not obviously conflict with existing rules and regulations, because otherwise we might be shut down, or the purpose for which we have created these instruments cannot be reached. So many financial instruments, much of the financial innovation we have seen over the last 20 years or so, of course, was made in order to mitigate the effect of law on private actors. But precisely for these instruments, it's absolutely important to make sure that these new instruments are deemed to be legal by supervisors and courts, because otherwise they could not possibly serve that function to mitigate the effect of law. They would simply be declared null and void. This is precisely why the banks that are issuing these instruments are hiring high-powered and highly paid lawyers, of course, to design these instruments and ensure their compatibility with law. Let me give you one concrete example. I think you're all familiar with the International Swaps and Derivatives Association in London, which was founded in 1984. And if you go to their webpage, it is the who is who in financial institutions that are issuing fancy instruments, and the who is who in the law firms in different jurisdictions where they are traded. What does ISDA do? It creates standard or model contracts for derivatives and swaps, and it tailors them for different jurisdictions around the world. There are standard contracts for Europe, for North America, or for Asia, because they're tailoring to different jurisdictions. They've also gone around the world and have lobbied 50 legislatures to change their bankruptcy codes to make sure that their netting agreements would be accepted by the bankruptcy legislation, essentially prioritizing derivatives counterparties over all other creditors in the systems. So what they have done, they have engineered their products to be compatible with domestic law, and if and when it wasn't entirely compatible, they have lobbied national legislatures to make their law compatible with these instruments. Without this intermediation by ISDA, we would not have had a 60 trillion market in derivatives. They're legally constructed, they're supported by being enforceable in courts of law. Most of them are structured under the law of England or the law of the state of New York. There is no such thing as an internationally traded financial asset that is not rooted in some legal system and enforceable at least in one. The second point is that all of these instruments are created legally and are enforceable. They have to be vindicated, so this is important. Sometimes people say, well, what do you mean it's legal or it's law? Most people are doing this in a private fashion, fine. But already over 100 years ago, people have argued about what is law and when is something law that wasn't created by lawyers or legislatures. Whenever something is vindicated by courts or regulators, that basically makes it law. What does it mean then when we think about law and finance? Well, one thing we have to do, I think we have to rearrange the law and finance dichotomy, if not get rid of it. If finance is legally constituted, it makes no sense really to think about finance as being separate by law. I'm not saying it is identical with law, but these are interdependent yet distinct systems that really work jointly rather than separately in any meaningful way. They evolve, they co-evolve over time, and we have to understand them as such. Another implication follows from that is that there is no such thing as deregulation. Any form of deregulation is simply the delegation of regulation to non-state actors, while implicitly guaranteeing them the full force of the law and the court system to enforce their contracts and property rights. So when the 1974 Treasury Amendment basically said that the foreign exchange futures market would be off the charts for the CFTC, they basically handed over the regulation of these markets to the largest banks, the Fed and the Treasury, through the Office of the Control of the Currency. And they have created new mechanisms to govern the markets. There is a foreign exchange committee at the New York Fed, where the market players with the largest market share are sitting around the table. And it's governed by the state of New York, because this is all happening in New York. And yet it's not entirely local, because this is one of the largest foreign exchange markets in the world, yet governed by the state of New York and some federal regulations as well, plus of course the private arrangements that they have entered into. And then finally, what about public versus private? If every private arrangement that holds water must be vindicated by law, we have to somehow become a little bit softer on that dichotomy too. Let me come to the next and somewhat interrelated point, which is to argue that finance is neither public nor private, market or state. It is hybrid, and it has essential hybridity characters. And I want to sort of give Perry, together with Geoffrey Hodgson, the credit for coining that phrase at our workshop in September, where we pulled all the elements of our theory together in a final workshop. It's essentially hybridic. And what does that mean? So let's start from the top this time and think about what state money is. Well, state money is the legal tender That's what every country does. It defines that something is the legal tender by default. That's what most of these transactions in this country have to use for their transactions. Of course, you can, again, issue an IOU, but you cannot simply, without authorization or some kind of vindication by law, use completely different currencies on your domestic rounds. We see sometimes this spills over in Russia after transition or so, but in principle, every country defines something as the legal tender. It is the currency for final settlement by the banks with the central bank. It is the currency in which the state collects its revenue and pays most, of course not all, of its debt. And at some level, the liquidity of all other privately created monies depends on their ability to be convertible into cash. Not all always have to be convertible into cash, but of course we know from crisis situations that at some point the only asset that is safe is the legal tender, and that's what we want to have. We want to hold dollars, or we want to hold closed dollar substitutes, and this is treasury bills, and of course these are also issued by the state and prove the argument. This is essentially hybrid. And then finally, only a sovereign has access to unlimited resources of high-powered money. The very definition of private entities is that they have a hard budget constraint. You can't just produce endlessly new resources without being held accountable or to task at some level. I'm not saying that all sovereigns have access to unlimited resources of high-powered money. Those that have given up their currency don't, and those that issue most of their debt in foreign currency also don't. So Ireland is not the same like the United States, right? Neither is Argentina, even though it has its own currency, but it had to default at some point because it couldn't really do the safety net for its own country because it had to pay back its debt in dollars. There's another false dichotomy, of course, that comes up, which is state versus market. It has very much overlap to what I said before, so I don't want to say too much about that here again. But also the public-private breaks down at some level. Or we have to rethink what it actually means to have, let's say, private backstops rather than sovereign backstops. So while I think it's true that only sovereigns have unlimited resources to high-powered money, we see, of course, and Perry has again worked a lot on that, we see a lot of private intermediaries step in and play a role as backstops. Goldman Sachs was the backstop for Bear Stearns unless it no longer was. And then the only place to go was upwards in the hierarchy of finance to the Fed. You can point to, MF Global maybe, helping by betting on sovereign debt in Europe and buying a lot of that sovereign debt. In a way, it worked like a private backstop on that debt of some of these countries there, until it no longer was able to do this because it was running out of money itself, at which point for it, there was no other way than to bankruptcy because that entity was small enough to fail. So private backstops can be first in line backstops, but typically they're only second to last resort backstops, and they cannot do the last resort lender or dealer functions in most cases. You could, of course, argue the sovereign wealth funds have played something like a role as backstops in the financial crisis in 2007, but they also stopped doing it at some point, and that's when the sovereigns came in. One point I just want to throw out here, while it's important to think about the backstopping function and sort of the lender of last resort and dealer of last resort function when we talk about essential hybridity, I want to emphasize that the propensity of making use of that is a function of how we have legally designed the financial system in the first place. So if it's a little bit more robust and not quite as fragile, we don't have to breach, basically, into the public purse too often, and so we can at least uphold the idea that there's a separation between the public and the private for a while. But when push comes to shove, and when you put the stress test on the system, we have an essentially hybrid system. Now let me say a few words about the law of finance paradox, which I think is also critical because it reshapes the debate about what law of finance is. And here is how it goes. So I said at the beginning, we are building this theory on the premise that there is fundamental uncertainty and liquidity constraints. If you take this as a given, then you realize that if all contracts were enforced as written, the system would self-destruct. It has to. Because if events occur that nobody has anticipated in their implications for the systems, and you nonetheless enforce all contracts, the system will go down. To avoid that outcome, the binding power of law must be relaxed, if not suspended. And yet, and that's why it's paradoxical, if we suspend the binding power of law, we are undermining the most important function of law in the financial system, which is to make commitments credible. So law and finance are interlocked in a way that on the one hand you say we want to have credible commitments, and the law is backing them by making the legal system available for enforcing them. And yet if we did this irrespective of context and change in circumstances, we will put the system on autopilot basically to self-destruction. I think the best example for them is AIG and AIG London. So AIG London issues all the CDSs to major international banks, which have contracted for ex ante in very detailed, complex contractual documents that if the underlying asset prices, effectively the housing markets in the United States, drop by more than X, then the insurer has to put up additional collateral calls to make sure that they can live up to the commitments they've made. As a result of these legal commitments, when housing prices indeed went down, even though they had been deemed to be not very likely to go down, but when they went down, AIG London had to dole out $31 billion in the first 8 months of 2008. How did they finance that? Well, they had pre-negotiated an open credit line with AIG United States, the parent company. And so they bled AIG US basically to death. And when the Fed went in, through the bailout arrangement in the fall of 2008, it rescued AIG, but still the company was bleeding because they hadn't taken care of the contractual commitment that the subsidiary had made and the contractual relationship between the subsidiary and the parent, which is why actually there's a lot of litigation going on right now, whether actually the directors and managers of AIG or the government, once it stepped in, has violated its fiduciary duty by not canceling these contracts. What the government essentially did in the end is buy out all the CDSs at nominal value to get rid of this bleeding effect that was contractually hardwired. These were precisely the legal commitments people made to make CDSs an attractive asset. And so they basically gave 16-point-something billion dollars to Société Générale, 14 billion to Goldman Sachs, and about 8.5 billion to Deutsche Bank, and there were like a handful of other international banks that benefit from American taxpayers' money in this way. So again, once we realize the law of finance paradox, that there's this tension between law and finance, and yet they are interlocked. It takes the two to tango, essentially. I think then when we think about law and finance, we have to realize that there would not be a global financial system without law. And yet law, paradoxically, can bring the entire system down if it is too rigid. As I said before, there are other not so important dichotomies. I think you can argue this case, whether or not you believe that actors are embedded or that they're rational or irrational. I think you can actually show that when they're rational, it's even more likely that this self-destruction of the system will happen, so we don't really need animal spirits here. Now comes the next element. How do we deal with the situation? When the law of finance paradox is allowed to run its course, what happens next? Well, empirically, we observe that in the last instance, at least, when the whole system gets into reverse, we make law more elastic, or we suspend the full effect of the law. In principle, AIG should have gone bankrupt, right? And that would have actually resulted in canceling out all the contracts that they would have had with others. And of course, that would have meant that they would have had to go out and find some ways to cover their loss, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why it wasn't done, because there was a real fear that it would bring down the entire system. Now, what is important here is that I think empirically we can show, but I really want to make, I want to do more research to show that this is systematically true, but I think we can show it with a couple of cases. In general, the pattern seems to be that law is more elastic at the apex or core of the system than on its periphery. Under the Federal Reserve Act, the Fed could lend against adequate collateral. If you look into any private arrangements about lending against collateral, the collateral will be highly specific. When you look at the design of swap contracts, these are tens, if not hundreds, of pages of detailed legal commitments. If you look at the swap contracts between the 5 major central banks, there are 7 pages. These are gentlemen's agreements. We will help each other out. They are negotiable and renegotiable. They are elastic at the core. Now, if you think about the implications of that, again, for our dichotomies, we can see that, again, state versus market, public versus private is a little bit problematic. What really matters is where you are in the hierarchy of the system. If you are private, but you're very close to the core, you're very unlikely to go under, witness Goldman Sachs. If you're sovereign and you're on the periphery, you might, however, go under, witness some of the countries like Argentina and others who have actually defaulted in past debt and crisis, or witness the fate of Greece, which I think has become, by now, probably sufficiently peripheral to have open discussions about Grexit again. And then, of course, then we're coming to the final element here. When you think about the fact that law is actually not equally binding on everyone, but that there's a systematic pattern of law being relatively more elastic in some parts of the system, and this applies, by the way, both domestically and globally, then we have, I think, a road to start building a new political economy of finance, because precisely where law is elastic and can be suspended, power becomes salient. So we have to think about who makes these decisions, how are these agents made accountable, for whom are they making them, and what are the costs or the distributive effects of these decisions. So why is power important? Well, there is no legally enforceable claim to be rescued by public or private backstops. That is done at the pure discretion of these backstops. Goldman Sachs was not obliged to roll over the credit obligations of Bear Stearns before it failed. It did that because it wanted to stabilize the system, and when it pulled out, Bear Stearns had no legal claim against Goldman Sachs, at least not on those grounds. So going back to Bruce's presentation over lunch, yes, you get raped, or the probability of getting raped is much higher if you're further on the periphery than at the core of the system. Tragically, we don't necessarily have the choice as to where we are, and the same, of course, goes with the victimization of rape cases. So it's ultimately in the discretion of the backstop whom they decide to rescue. To give them credit, don't want to say this is a complete conspiracy theory. I think if you look at what the Fed did starting in the spring of 2008, it actually viewed the system as hierarchically structured. All the different facilities it created before it even started buying all the assets that Perry talked about today, it created liquidity facilities first for the primary dealers, those dealers who deal in US sovereign debt, then in those who fund the primary dealers, and then in those who fund the funders of the primary dealers, and only in November did they throw out a facility that would also deal with intermediaries that were funding housing or commercial paper and other assets for the real economy. So for the Fed, it was absolutely clear what was needed to protect the system. You want to keep funding the funding of the sovereign, and then those who are directly or indirectly related to that. So again, where law is elastic or becomes elastic, power becomes salient. That is in part a function of the legal or contractual design of financial instruments, but also of our allocation of powers in the division of power between home and host country regulators of financial intermediaries. It becomes a question of legal interpretation in times of crisis. Look what the ECB has done with the treaty that basically says, and you cannot basically give or buy the bonds of sovereigns. Well, what about sort of the latest round of of quantitative easing in Europe with the outright market transactions. What is that? It's a creative way of finding a way around that to stabilize the system. I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm just saying if this is happening, we also have to realize how it happens and what role law plays and when law really has to be made more elastic to support the system in the end. And of course, it's a question of enforcement too. So the relationship between law and finance, or law and power actually, is an interesting one. Law, of course, is designed very often to constrain power. We're trying to rein in discretionary decision makers, which is why Congress has shut back in the Dodd-Frank Act and has said the Fed will not have as much discretion next time around. On the other hand, power can suspend the effects of law, and that's what central banks have done quite frequently and maybe should have done. But on the other hand, if we want to have legal accountability, we may want to reduce the probability that the central banks have to do this too often. And if we don't, we shouldn't be surprised that the central banks become increasingly politicized, because what they're taking are essentially political decisions. So in a nutshell, the legal theory of finance basically says that starts from the premise that markets are unstable. That's a function of uncertainty, fundamental uncertainty and liquidity constraints. It is a rule-bound system that is essentially hybrid between markets and state, public and private. Law's function here is to vindicate financial contracts as credible commitment devices. And yet, that's the law and finance paradox, the strict legal commitments that are required to build large-scale financial system, if put together with fundamental uncertainty and the inherent instability of financial markets, can result in the self-destruction of financial markets, even without starting to talk about fraud and all the other things, which of course happen too. But even just on a pure legal basis, this is the logic of the system. In the last instance, therefore, it is an exercise of power, not necessarily law, that determines whether or not the system will survive. So I think, again, so if this is a theory in the making, there's lots of research that has to be done. I think we want to document much better the legal interconnectedness and the kind of legal commitments that different players make. I think there's vast room to develop predictions in a dynamic setting, especially when we throw in the political economy. So what do actors do to make sure they're close to a viable backstop? Do they make strategic moves and do they pay off? How can backstops make sure that they still retain their backstopping ability? What happens if the Fed says no next time because it's legally constrained or doesn't have the political clout to do this again? Will China step in, and what does it mean in terms of who is actually at the very top of the global financial system? So there are a lot of ideas to play with, and we're starting to develop this idea, and I'm hoping to build something like a PhD program with partners in Frankfurt and London or Oxford and hopefully later in Asia too, to develop some of these ideas further. But let me just close here by saying a few words about how we got there. Recall at the beginning we were looking at this mumble jumble of dichotomies, and that's not exactly what we did, but somehow, given the literature that we knew and the struggles we had with it, we were caved in a little bit by some dichotomies. We're thinking about law and finance and autonomous and embedded, rational and irrational. And then along the way, we tossed these dichotomies. Why did we do that? Because one of the fundamental premises, or actually agreements, commitments that we made when we participated in this project was to say, we will question every assumptions that we make. And every assumptions the theories make that we're trying to invoke, right? We just don't take these things for granted. So questioning both the theories and the dichotomies that are derived from them along the way, I think helped us to speak about these issues. I think what also helped is that we had specific case studies. So we were not only talking abstract things, but very specific cases, and could talk about them without the barriers of different disciplines intervening. So diversity for creating new ideas helps a lot, and collaborative research projects does too. And I think INET is just a wonderful interlocutor to create these kind of fora, as we see at this conference and elsewhere. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
So the shuttle buses don't come until 9. So we have plenty of time for discussion, and what a provocative talk this has been. Are there microphones floating around? Yes. Okay. So I open the floor. I can't actually see. There's like a light here. But, so he's making his way around. Yes.
There's something monolithic about your dichotomy of the law. I appreciated at the beginning when you're talking about how the derivatives writers tried to make their contract legally superior to others. But the fact is there were other earlier laws on the book. In New York State, the law of fraudulent conveyance would have given an opportunity for the debtors to claim that if you made a loan without having any idea of how the loan could be repaid, the law is declared fraudulent, null and void. The whole purpose of this was to prevent the kind of crisis that's coming, because this law was on the books, as you know, ever since New York was a colony. So obviously it's not the law that's power, it's particular people who have somehow sidetracked the law of fraudulent conveyance to put it in the hands of predators instead of the people whom the law for the last 200 years was supposed to protect.
Right. I think I'm not sure why you're using the term monolithic, but I think your example is a great one, because I think indeed many of the legal premises were on the books. The key for those who designed these instruments and their lawyers was to convince the regulators that this was not speculative, that what you were creating was not subject to fraudulent conveyance doctrines or other doctrines. And that's, I think, part of the negotiations that took place, precisely to make sure that these instruments looked as if there was a real asset rather than just a speculative interest, which would have brought this into the fraudulent conveyance camp. But that's part of what the legal engineering of new financial instruments is all about. Why did regulators go along? I think there's maybe also here political economy. Why didn't the courts strike them down? Well, you know, as courts sit there are reactive law enforcers. And they're the ones who would actually enforce such an instrument. So you have to build some cases that come to the courts before they can start invoking these principles. We're seeing some of that now with ex post facto, but very often, precisely because courts are reactive, they come too late to shape the process of financial innovation and the building of these markets.
Mine is on. No, go ahead. No. No, you're older than I am.
No, I'm not.
Okay. Well, I was happy to see that you kept the dichotomy between uncertainty and risk, that you got rid of the dichotomy between rational behavior and irrational behavior. But I wonder if you could explain a little bit better why you believe in this paradox that you mentioned, that if the law is not enforced, then it's going to self-destruct the financial system. It seems to me that if you know that indeed you have uncertainty and you have these possible liquidity problems, then you're going to devise legislation in such a way that you're never going to be in a situation where the financial system will self-destroy.
Okay, so that's a great comment, and I think you're exactly right. We can design the legal system, the examples in law that help us deal with that. The problem is, I think, that many of the privately created legal instruments do in fact create highly binding commitment devices that do not have many escape clauses. Now that is changing too. So during the crisis, or in the aftermath of the crisis, the Delaware courts actually have tolerated some clauses that allow people to walk away from a transaction if things have changed more than they had earlier. Let me give you a famous example that I love to give here, and actually how the law can accommodate fundamental uncertainty, but not all legal systems do this to the same extent. And again, very often it is the courts who have to resolve that, and the courts might come too late. But the example that I have in mind is hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s, when for years the courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, argued pacta sunt servanda. You have to enforce the contracts as written with the nominal value of the Reichsmark as it was, which basically meant that somebody who had given a mortgage in South Africa, prior to World War I, wanted to give the creditor 50,000 Reichsmarks in 1922 or so to say, now eliminate my mortgage. And obviously at the time you could barely buy a loaf of bread for 50,000 Reichsmark. So this went all the way up to the Supreme Court again, and actually under a situation where the court was in what some people have called an endogenous legal boom, because ever more creditors ran ever faster to the courts to enforce their contract. So the whole system was on the verge of collapse. In that situation, the Supreme Court says, hang on a second, we did say pacta sunt servanda, but we also have a provision in the code that says all contracts are subject to the principle of good faith. And if we enforce contracts under conditions that neither party could have foreseen, and if that enforcement of that contract would create great harm for at least one of the parties can make a claim for adaptation. And that's what the courts did. Now, American courts are much less inclined to do the kind of adaptation, but if contracting parties include these into their clauses, they are more likely to be enforced now than they used to be. And I think that's exactly the pitch I'm making right now. If we think about the financial system, we have to think about stabilizers, right? We have to think about stabilizers, and I think this goes to Pavlina's comments early on when we talk about employment. Stabilizers further down on the periphery, so that the pressures actually of the cascading system coming back to the very top doesn't build as fast. And we could play with that much more. There's a price. Right? So the idea that you have this fundamentally binding commitment so that you get access to capital, and that's what we're telling emerging markets and developing countries and subprime mortgage house owners, etc. We tell them you can get this only if you make this absolutely binding commitment, right? And I think we have to relax that notion in order to deal with the law of finance paradox.
Okay, thank you. The question I'd like to ask is the implications of globalization for the development of your theory. You asked Emma last night the implications of globalization for her work, and I'm really thinking about it from two perspectives. Globalization in the context of the advanced countries and cross-border flows, and what that might mean. Let's think about it just in terms of regulation, and who's responsible for that regulation from a legal point of view, and how should we think about that architecture? So that's one aspect, but the other aspect of globalization is obviously thinking about the integration of China, and how we should think about your theory moving forward in terms of the integration of what is, at the moment at least, a very different credit culture. So as you think about these globalization trends, what does that imply? How does your thinking move in the direction of globalization from both those perspectives?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the first thing I would say is that there is no such thing as a level playing field, right? So much of the harmonization and standardization of law that we're using, either through Basel or through IMF's international architecture, financial architecture, is to say if only everybody had the same set of rules, we could have a fully integrated financial system. If our theory is right, then having fully predictable laws and rules on the books is unlikely to hold water if events occur that we haven't anticipated, if there's fundamental uncertainty, and certainly not if we then have underlying contractual and other commitments that put people into very different positions vis-a-vis others. So if finance is hierarchical and global finance is hierarchical, building a legal systems with fixed predetermined rules creates a particular mechanism that will reinforce the divide between the periphery and the core. So that's my first response. The other response would be to say that I think we have to think about this slightly differently for different financial instruments. So if you think about foreign exchange markets, they're probably the largest transnational markets that we have. But most of it is happening in London and New York, and the agents or the intermediaries who trade in them are governed by English law and the law of New York. So you don't even have to think that global. You just have to think where the action is. And there, I think, again, we have to think about where power comes in, right? Sort of who is governing them and how is this done, and in particular. Sovereign debt, fascinating thing, right? What do we do with sovereign debt? We do not have a global resolution mechanism for sovereign debt, and Kruger proposed this about 10 years ago. Instead, we have all agreed that CACs, collective action clauses, are the solution. But what do CACs do? They say, in the event that the parties want to renegotiate, here's a voting mechanism to do so. They do not do what I just told you the German Civil Code does, in saying if there are circumstances under which it would be harmful for one of the parties to enforce this contract, and neither party could have possibly foreseen that, you can ask for adjustment, which requires you have a third-party arbiter to go and do it for you. That's what CACs can't do. So I think if we want to have a resolution mechanism, or actually sort of an earlier control of sovereign debt markets, we need something where the debtor countries can say, stop. We cannot go this way anymore. And I could go on. So let me just, China. So all financial markets are institutionally and legally constructed. So I have taken a look at inside the Chinese financial system about 2 or 3 years ago and looked at the governance structure of the financial system. And so I want to qualify when I say everything is legally constructed. It is in China, but not only legally, right? So yes, they have all the laws that we can think of right now, and banking regulators and securities regulators, and they don't look that different from ours. But the shots are called elsewhere. So when you look at the top people in the top privatized banks, and you look at where they come from and where they might also sit, you're coming up with a cadre of about 150 top personnel who have almost all, spent at least 5 years in the Ministry of Finance, the People's Banks of China, or another key state organization, and have been promoted to their current positions by the Communist Party of China. So where law becomes elastic, power calls the shots. In China, I would say much of the governance of the financial system is done through human capital management, not through regulation, and is very much in the hands of a particular committee in the Communist Party. And the question I asked myself then when I wrote this paper is, how will this system work when you internationalize? And there are 2 ways you can go. You can say it has to completely change. But then if you look at what China has done over the last couple of years in integrating itself with different agents and intermediaries, so Morgan Stanley, Blackstone, right? CIC, the China Investment Corporation, it creates long-term relations. It can't control their promotion systems for sure, but it creates close relations with some intermediaries that now, and they have outsourced their investment to them. So I think they will probably continue to call the shots more through informal things. They don't sit on any of these boards. They absolutely refuse to do that. They keep their stakes low enough that they don't get into the purview of any major regulators. And yet, you know, with $200 or $300 billion the CIC can invest, it has quite a bit of power.
Thank you. Thank you for your insightful speech. The talk at my table was all about the catchword moral risk, both for banks and the system itself. Could I invite your thoughts on exploring the concept of moral risk, both for a legal perspective from the state of New York and a global perspective, both from the banks and the legal system itself? What is legal flexibility? What does financial institutional flexibility? What does the actual what do the actual undertakings of financial systems mean in terms of moral risk?
Moral risk.
Moral risk.
Right. So it's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you know, we want to create predictable commitment devices. We want to have rule of law-based systems, and I'm all in favor of that too. And I'm basically arguing if we take this too far, if we don't create some buffers, some safety valves along the way, we're probably putting the system on a way to self-destruction, right? And then the question, of course, comes in within that system, how can people game it either way? Can people game it when you have very strict commitments? Of course they can, right? You can. So it's not the case necessarily that you have binding contracts and strict regulations and everything is enforced, that the system cannot be gamed. We just heard exactly how it is being gamed. We're basically renegotiating the interpretation of the rules. And that, of course, is morally wrong because you're adding to the instability while pretending that everything is under control. But that can happen. And then the other aspect of it is, you know, even if everybody was doing the right thing according to their contracts, I think if something completely unpredictable happens in the future, this beautifully legally designed system may actually destabilize very fast. So I see the point, but I think it can actually play out in both games when we think about bad players and good players, which is why I'm a little bit ambiguous about its implications.
right? These are more two comments than questions. I mean, the first one is flagging the importance of the distinction that you made between knowledge and information and risk and uncertainty. I think this is crucial, and if one takes it seriously, one should stop, should ban any modeling of financial market have as a multitude of agents having the same probability distribution or whatever, an approximation to the same probability distribution, and simply having different risk aversion. Agents have got different vision of the world, different types of knowledge, even conditioned on the same information. So let us stop this idea of a fundamentally transparent world in which everyone has got the same knowledge, and maybe there are variations in the signal that they receive from a uniform world. The second comment is about power. There is a consensus among economists not to talk about power. And power is generally reduced to endowments. No, power is power, and is well beyond endowments. And I think this should be very high on the agenda of all economists. Take power, bring power into the economic analysis.
Yes, thank you. I don't think I have to comment on that. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure where the second microphone is. Okay.
Yeah.
You have the squatter's rights here. Yes.
Do you hear me? Yes. My name is Aske Thorvarsson. I just wanted to ask you one question with a little bit of comment beforehand. I think one example of what you described so well in your lecture is what is used to be used as the signal of the crisis, the Lehman Brothers Bank. Mm-hmm. Because based on the case studies I've done in my research on the Scandinavian banks, all the bankers I've interviewed there said, Lehman was no problem for us. We solved it in, the collapse of Lehman Brothers was all contractually backed with collateral in cash, and we had gone out of that exposure 1 week after they fell. Yes. So I think that's an example of a legal structure that actually holds. So maybe the problems were somewhere else than Lehman. But then I haven't looked at it. But my comment is then on if you could give feedback on the regulatory arbitrage when we are talking about the globalization of the financial market and between countries where we have the good regulatory arbitrage. Thank you.
So on Lehman, I think, again, the full autopsy of Lehman still has to be done. It's not that easy. The good news is we have tens of thousands of court documentation at this stage, which are fairly public. So if one wants to do them, one can. It just needs a lot of time and resources. But I think arguing that we are no longer directly exposed to Lehman and the assets is either issued or holding is probably not enough. What happened is that the money market fund was affected because they held some of this crap. And if you then are indirectly linked to the money markets, you might be exposed to that. So I think the interdependencies are much more complex. Some of them are legally designed. Many legal instruments make direct reference to other assets. Derivatives particularly do that, but others do too, or they make references to the price of treasuries, or they make reference to certain exchange rates, or they make reference to something like LIBOR, which we also know is no longer some kind of a market thing, but is a socially embedded, constructed anchor interest rate, and we no longer like the way it's being constructed, but we have to find another way because we probably cannot always rely on the market to come up with a price that is easily observable, because when they don't, they don't. And that's what happened with LIBOR in the financial crisis. So on Lehman, I think the conundrum of this theory is that I think what we would need to prove or disprove it, or if we really think about it, it has some value, we want to do something about regulation, we need much more information about the exposure of different financial intermediaries to one another and the terms of that exposure, which means we would have to know the private contracting terms, which we don't have access to. We now have some access to them that happened in the crisis, but many of the new ones that are currently being created to evade rules, and here I'm coming to your second point, we also don't really know how they're being created, and of course it's all proprietary information and you don't really get your hands on it. So I would love to have much more information. I think regulators too should have that. I wrote a little INET blog a couple of months ago, and looking at a graph the ECB put up in its stability report, where they were trying to figure out what the exposure of individual banks is to one another, and they were getting the information from the European Banking Authority, and all they could do is to do simulation analysis, because the national bank, central banks do not release the information of individual bank exposure. They only give you the information at the aggregate level. So if I don't even know the volume or the value of the exposure, and I do not know the underlying legal structures, I cannot fully understand the relative stability of my financial system. I think we need more information. Now, on the regulatory arbitrage point, I think this is just part, of course, of a competitive financial system, that you arbitrage around rules. If you want to get a competitive advantage over your competitor, one of the ways of doing that is to make sure that the costly regulation affects you less than your competitor. The problem is if you have a highly competitive financial systems where yields have been squeezed out everywhere, and the regulators have allowed a legal plural or dualist system to emerge by delegating some rule making to some, so making the cost lower and allowing people to easily migrate between the two, you're setting yourself up to a system where regulatory arbitrage becomes the most important issue in improving your competitive advantage over others. And I think that's a little bit where we are.
So we have in the back, and then here, and then here.
Yeah, you touched on something that I've seen, that the financial innovation is often aimed at circumventing regulation. And even throughout financial history of crises, this seems to be a common theme, that the regulators are always one step behind. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what can you do about that, if anything?
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And we're always resolving by regulation the past crisis and don't know how to deal with the future. I think we could make some progress if we realize that we cannot predict the future, if there's fundamental uncertainty not only for market participants, but also for regulators. This is why I think it's completely crazy to waste 10 years of our time to write sort of some new rules in Basel and then wait until all countries have implemented them. That creates petrification in the regulatory system, because by the time everything is implemented, nobody will change them again short of another crisis. Right? But if you are dealing with an inherently unstable financial system that evolves very fast and where we have fundamental uncertainty lurking around the corner, it's crazy to think about predetermined fixed regulatory principles to deal with the system. So let's change that. What do we need instead? Of course we need some regulation. We need some safety valves, I said before. I think we need a much more procedurally based regulatory regime that does two things. One, bottom up, it creates safety valves on the periphery in a different contractual arrangements where those guys with the back against the wall can come in and say, we need to adjust. This is not going anywhere because it's sort of becoming a systemic effect. We need more of that, and we have to think about how to design it so it cannot be gamed. Of course it will be gamed. Everything will be gamed. We just start from that, right? The question is how we can deal with this in a maybe slightly better way than we currently are doing. And the other thing we need at the top, rather than having rigid predetermined rules and just agreeing on for some entities, we're again creating a dualist regulatory structure. We're regulating whatever we have called banks in law. We're not regulating everything else that walks and talks like a bank, but it's not a bank by law. Crazy, right? So what do we do here? I think we need actually something like, I call it something like a 9/11 switchboard. We need somebody who can be alerted to bringing the right people around the table to try to respond to a looming financial crisis, and earlier rather than later. So we need an early response system with fairly great flexibility to respond to the crisis that we have. So there is discretion here, and we have to think very hard about how to make that a bit more accountable.
Yeah, so I think my question is a follow-up to this one, but so the theme is dichotomies, and you had many of them, but I want to throw a new one, which is the one between complexity and simplicity. So Andy Haldane has a speech that is making the rounds in the past few weeks on saying that the financial system is increasing in complexity, and the reaction was that the regulatory system had to increase in complexity as well. So Basel I had simple capital requirement ratios, then there was off-balance sheet transactions, so Basel II became more complicated and model-based, but that didn't quite work. So what the new response should be. And Andy seems to side with the idea that you don't fight complexity with complexity, you fight it with simplicity. Maybe that's a better strategy. So I wonder if there is well, what do you think about this for financial regulation in particular, but also if there is precedent in other areas, maybe other legal systems that have to deal with increasingly complex subject matters and how they responded. The silly example that comes to mind is, for example, family law and reproductive rights and so on and so forth that have become increasingly complex over the years. What was the response?
Yeah. So this is a very good point. So I take another dichotomy on board, complexity versus simplicity, and I think it's an important one. And I think it's important for reasons you have suggested. One is that it's much harder to observe where the market might be destabilizing for a highly complex system. It's much harder to regulate, so maybe we want to make it a little bit more simple. I'm a little bit ambiguous about this one because I also think that the complex financial instruments that have been created are not all evil as such. Under certain conditions, they can become weapons of mass destruction. Particularly, I think, if we just lend to them without looking closer the full coercive powers of the state, and thereby make them credible and scalable in that sense. So I think, but I don't want to just close down the entire derivative markets. I think that would be crazy too. So if we think about complexity, we have to think about what we mean by that, and I think we can actually have more simple responses, again, by the law actually withholding its enforcement power on certain conditions, right? Saying we will enforce if these and those requirements have been met, otherwise we will not, or we will not commit ex ante to do that. And this might result in an adaptation of the kind of financial products that have been created. So I think the process that you create is actually, yes, more complex, simple rules, more complex response, more complex rules, even more complex responses, and we lose completely control. We have to just basically, I think, go back, but we also have to be smart in regulating in a way that we change the incentives to create yet another very complex thing just to make sure that the regulators don't understand it, right? So if we take that out, maybe we have more meaningful financial innovation. Other areas of the law that have been complex, family law, you might, but still I think it's much simpler because we actually have only few agents that can be, can incentivize them in different ways, how to organize around. But yes, very complex issues. I think some of the property rights debates deal with very, very complex issues. We are, among economists, I think the notion what property rights are is a very highly simplistic one. It's mostly about the power to exclude, and that then brings you the entire story about internalization, externalization, etc. If you look into real legal doctrine, you find highly complex, nuanced property regimes, very different for marital property than for IP or for trusts or for corporations. So there are actually adaptations to specific configurations that have evolved over time. And I think so in finance too, we probably need some more tailored responses, which is why I think we have to have more safety valves further down in the system to deal with some of these issues and create room for nuanced responses which don't have to be necessarily complex. Right, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
A quick question. How do you deal with conventions? I mean, Keynes' solution to uncertainty was the existence and persistence and then the breakdown of conventions about what goes on in finance and also other parts of life, of course. Now, you haven't mentioned that. I mean, you've talked about fundamental uncertainty, but you haven't talked about it. It's kind of a Ptolemaic, it's an epicycle, but somehow that must enter into the way you should think about these things, no?
Yes. No, I think this is a good point. I mean, I probably have to think about this a little bit more, but my direct response would be, we see a lot of conventions built into contracts. It might not always be the right convention. So what do law firms do when they create a new financial instrument? They take the template from the last and throw in a couple of extra things, because they don't really know what they're doing either. But this can have actually it's not only a way to make the world a bit more predictable and manageable, it does that for the lawyers. But it doesn't do this necessarily for the world as a systemic level, because the built-in features of these contracts might have results or produce results in the future that we can't fully anticipate. So there's enormous amounts of conventions in the way we create laws and regulations, and very much informed by a legal system, and there is therefore a certain level of autopoiesis, as some people say this in system theory, like Luhmann and then Teubner in Germany, who sort of think that legal systems actually evolve themselves autonomously because they create their own conventions and they don't shift radically. But in doing so, they're making the system predictable for the legal actors, but not necessarily for the financial system, and if both are intertwined, I think we don't know really what the combined reaction would be. But I'll think more about this.
Richard Werner from Southampton University. Sorry, I lost my voice in Taipei, where I've just come from. Two things very quickly. Number one, you mentioned legal tender and state money. I wonder, are you aware, would you agree with the following, that I think we have basically two types of legal tender: the jure, the formal legal tender, the official legal tender, if you want, which I think would recognize, and then the de facto unofficial legal tender, which also exists, because, for example, the state in almost all countries has chosen to accept private money in lieu of tax payments, namely money issued by banks. Because of course legal tender is a diminishing part of the money supply, 3%. Yes. 97% is actually bank money, which technically, legally, is not legal tender, but in practice serves as legal tender. Secondly, Michael mentioned the state of New York law on fraudulent conveyance. Another example, which I think is also very relevant for the financial crisis, of course, is you mentioned the CDS contracts. Now, when we teach those to our students, we explain them as insurance contracts, because that's what they are, and like options, and that's why you have a premium. However, well, in fact, the law was very good on this, insurance contracts. We have a law 1788, the Insurance Act in England, which says that you can only insure something that is at risk for you, the person who's insuring it. And that prevents, of course, speculation, all sorts of risky results and negative outcomes for society. Now, what then happened was that the lobby power that you mentioned was used by the banks and AIG and so on to argue in London and New York that, well, these derivative contracts, traded derivatives, CDSs, are not insurance contracts. And their logic was actually quite surprisingly simple, or not really convincing. The logic was that they were arguing, well, they couldn't be insurance contracts, because if they were, they would be illegal. In any case, the law was right, but we saw the lobbying power interpreting it. And that's, I think, a really important theme. So I would agree with, is it Sergio? Sorry. Right. I would entirely agree with you that power seems to be very important, because, yes, the law is important, but if we have power and powerful groups that can interpret at will, then isn't that really the important issue? Right. You mentioned China, that, oh, they have laws, they have institutions, but actually there's a bunch of people who interpret them as they will. Well, hang on, isn't that exactly the same in London and New York? Would you agree?
Yeah. No, I think these are very good points. So on the legal tender first, absolutely, it doesn't play the same role anymore. It's still, of course, on the books, and ultimately the validation of the non-state monies depends on the state accepting it. So in that sense, you know, in the end, they also want to be convertible into that legal tender, or at least be absorbed by the central bank if push comes to shove. So they must make that case. I want to say one more thing, and that's sort of a prediction I derive from this theory, is that that if you think through the hierarchy of money and this instability and the tendency of law to treat the periphery and the core differentially, I think it's not surprising that what we observe is a high concentration of major financial intermediaries very close to the core, the twin core of the global financial system, which is New York and London. And that's actually where rules become negotiable. I mean, the Foreign Exchange Committee at the Fed has the market players with the largest market share right sitting there in the committee, and they make governance together. And of course, the Fed is sort of a participant in the markets, in foreign exchange markets, right? Not only a governor. So this is a club-like governance arrangements, and I think we see that elsewhere too, and that is being exploited by those who play the game. So this goes back, you know, can we actually reconstitute the system somehow? Because the logic of the system creates actually concentration of power that makes it very difficult to unwind. And I think one of the things that I do say in the paper that I just drafted is we shouldn't be surprised that it's so hard to reform the system, because where it would need to be reformed is at the very core, where the political forces make it almost impossible. Now, my hope is that by making the law a little bit more flexible at the periphery, the game that you can always expand in the periphery and cut loose from it if things go wrong can't be played forever. So the increasing concentration at the core won't play itself out quite as much, but that's a longer term picture. But in the end, yes. Since I've done the China study, I've always wanted to do a similar study about England and London. I wouldn't be surprised about the results, that I can easily imagine the personal networks at the very core of the system are quite dense.
So I've lost track of the other microphone.
Speak up.
I'm not sure where the other microphone is. I can't call on somebody.
No, they have both. There are no callers. I think they're floating.
So maybe we're done. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Center on Global Legal Transformation, and she serves as a member of its Committee on Global Thought. But I got to know her because she's principal investigator of the Global Finance and Law Initiative, an INET-funded collaborative research project aimed at reconceptualizing the relationship between finance and law. I actually wrote a paper for her, and let me tell you, she's a taskmaster. In 2012, she received the Max Planck Research Award for her contributions to international financial regulation, and she's still moving. She's going to talk to us today about dichotomies in law and finance. Welcome, Katharina Pistor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would really like to thank CG and INET for having me, for putting up this great event. And I also want to thank all of you, because I have to say this kind of economics conferences is actually also fun for non-economists. And I've attended a lot of economist conferences in the past, and for the most part, the big issues are background music to methodologies that are not being questioned, so that people can poke holes into each other's models, whether econometrics, algebra, or game theory. So going back to big issues and putting methodology back on the table, I find really stimulating, and so thanks for doing this all together here. When I wrote my grant 2 years ago, roughly, to launch this project, the Global Finance and Law Initiative, I had some conversations with INET people, and at the time I was saying, if you really want to change the way we think about the economy, you cannot only talk to economists. Precisely because economics has been so expansionary and almost imperialist, you have to talk to other disciplines. And in particular, you have to talk to lawyers, because they have translated for the last 40 years economics into hardwired regulations, laws, and legal interpretations. And we teach this stuff daily at law schools. We don't even teach an introductory course in law and economics anymore, because people feel that it has made its way into all disciplines anyway, so we can do away with that. But it's done in a hard.
We're just about ready to turn the podium over to our keynote speaker this evening, but a couple of quick procedural announcements first. anyone who asked around dinner time for a shuttle change, check in with reception on your way out to get the updated details on that. And the shuttle back to the hotels will leave here at 9 p.m. So just a couple of final words on my part before we close out. I have spent the weekend looking around, and I see, even here at dinner, central bankers and monetary theorists, graduate students, people of all kinds, people that I know from many different places, and I see you all exchanging ideas and talking together and building something of a community. It is, to me, quite encouraging. So thank you for that. Just a few words of thanks to all the CG team, to Paul and Rohinton and Fred and Colleen. Thank you very much for having us and for all your work. A very, very special thanks to Agatha and Lauren, who did a huge amount of work before the conference. Before the conference and during the conference, getting everyone here and making everything happen. They made my life very easy, so thank you very much. I give you now Perry Merling to introduce our keynote speaker. Thanks.
And of course, we want to thank Dan. Yes. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, a distinguished scholar and really good friend of mine, Katharina Pistor. She's the Michael Sovern Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and director of the university's
highly non-reflected fashion. And I think if we wanted to really change the way we think about economics and govern economics, we have to bring the lawyers back in. So I'm all the more grateful for having received some startup funds from INET to launch this initiative. And what it was really was an initiative of bringing 9 scholars around a table from economics, law and economics, and socioeconomics to rethink the relationship between law and finance. And when I first argued that you have to talk about to lawyers because they're important for translating economics, I think after having spent 2 years with INET money thinking about these issues, I have become more radicalized. And I would now say you cannot even understand finance if you don't put law up front and center. Okay, so let me explain why. But I want to do this in a fashion that also speaks to the theme of the conference, the false dichotomies, because I found it intriguing to think about the journey that we took on this project through the lens of the dichotomy story. So I basically sat back and said, well, what kind of dichotomies have been abound in the field of law and finance as discussed over the last 20 years or so? And clearly there's been always law and finance, and the assumption was there is finance out there and then law fixes things that finance can't fix on its own, so you deal with market failures and you deal with information problems and transaction problems, etc. Then of course there's the big dichotomy of state and market, of public and private, money and credit, rational and irrational, autonomous embedded, uncertainty and risk, knowledge and information, law and power, a mumble jumble of dichotomies. Where do we start and where do we end? Which ones of them are important? Which ones of them are true and which ones of them are false? So clearly, as we all know, dichotomies are useful sometimes to frame an issue, just to have the two polar points of a debate carved out. They're very often more tractable than entire complex theories. They're useful heuristic devices, but of course they also overstate the differences between these two concepts on the polar ends, and thereby I think they very often stand in the way of re-theorizing. So we have to take them with caution. They're useful, but they can also be problematic. Now, from the perspective of this project that I have been running over the last 2 years, what turned out now with hindsight, and I did not think about this as we walked through this project, as we did this, is we started this project actually with a set of dichotomies that I was conscious of. So we said it is about the relationship of law and finance, and we pitched them at two opposite ends. It is about state versus markets, and we felt what was also really important was whether actors are either autonomous or embedded, or whether they're rational or irrational. Well, as we went through the project, I think some of the dichotomies turned out to be sort of false or had to be reconceptualized as synthesis rather than dichotomies. And I think that goes for law and finance, state and market, public-private, money versus credit. And some turned out to be simply of relatively less importance than we had thought up front, and I would say that goes for autonomous versus embedded, rational versus irrational. And then there were some dichotomies that turned out to be really critical. So uncertainty versus risk, knowledge versus information, and law versus power were critical for building a new theory. And what I'm talking about here is we're trying to build or develop an inductive theory that is basically using observations of the real world financial system as we have observed it through the lens of selected case studies, and we're generalizing about the structure of finance from that. So it's an inductive, not a deductive theory. But once some of these dichotomies are critical because they help us build this theory, and jointly with some of the non-dichotomous or new synthesis, they offer, I would argue, a coherent reconceptualization of finance and help us to derive some important implications. So what are the building blocks of this new legal theory of finance? And I want to be modest here. My paper that I'm just finished writing and we're submitting for publication very soon is called Towards a Legal Theory of Finance. So I'm not claiming that we're entirely there yet, and maybe you can help us get there. So we're basically starting from several premises that are straight out of economics, at least some parts of economics, but I think at least with respect to fundamental uncertainty, it's so widely acknowledged that I would simply call it a premise, some basic facts that few people would dispute. I realize that on the second concept, the second premise, liquidity constraint, there is so much more debate, and nonetheless, I think the evidence of the global financial crisis shows quite evidently that sometimes there is liquidity, and then the next day it might be gone, so there must be something like a liquidity constraint. And jointly, these two premises render financial markets inherently unstable. So that's nothing new, that's not something that we are adding. But what we are adding is to suggest that financial systems are rule-bound systems, that they're actually essential hybrid rather than being either state or market or private or public, that there's something called the law of finance paradox that is very different from the conceptualization that law is the crutches to a financial system that can barely manage on its own, just needs a little bit support. Also that law is actually not always the binding, credible commitment that it's portrayed to be, but it is elastic. And it's elastic in a particular way, namely it is elastic at the core and rather rigid on the periphery. And that leads us essentially to a political economy of finance, which is to suggest that actually power is the differential relationship to law. Where law becomes elastic, power becomes salient. So let me try to illustrate these different elements, and I will come back to some of the dichotomies that we drop, refine, or synthesize along the way. I don't think I have to say much here about fundamental uncertainty, so I just want to skip over this. Knight and Keynes and others, of course, have said this. We think there are two dichotomies here. It is really important to distinguish uncertainty and risk.